What would you do if the person you love turned out to be hiding a dark secret? Could you face the truth if it shattered everything you believed in? In this shocking case, we unravel the story of a newlywed husband who accidentally discovers his wife is a racist, a revelation that spirals into an unforgettable, jaw-dropping twist. Set in the heart of Dallas, Texas, this story takes us through betrayal, confrontation, and consequences so shocking they'll leave you questioning everything. But this isn't just about hidden prejudice or broken trust. It's about the choices we make when everything falls apart. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss gripping stories like this one. And tell us, have you ever uncovered a shocking secret? Share your experience below. We're curious to hear. David and Emily had just returned from their honeymoon, a picturesque getaway to the beaches of Hawaii. Their wedding had been the talk of their small town in Dallas, Texas. Emily was the quintessential Southern belle. Blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and a charm that could light up any room. Entrepreneur with a magnetic personality had swept Emily off her feet with his intelligence and warm sense of humor. Together, they seemed like the perfect couple. Friends often said they were made for each other, and for a while, David believed it too. Their love story had all the makings of a fairy tale, until one seemingly ordinary evening shattered everything. It was late autumn, and the newlyweds had just moved into their cozy suburban home. The fireplace crackled as David unpacked a box of wedding gifts, while Emily sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone. The warmth of their new beginning seemed to fill the room. "Can you believe how lucky we are?" Emily asked, her voice light and dreamy. David smiled, walking over to place a gentle kiss on her forehead. "We've worked for it," he replied. "This is just the beginning of our beautiful life together." But as the night wore on, something began to feel off. David had always admired Emily's vibrant personality, but that evening, her laughter carried a tone that unsettled him. She was scrolling through social media, commenting on posts, and chuckling at memes. At first, David thought nothing of it. Emily loved her humor, and it was one of the things he adored about her. But then he heard her mutter something under her breath. It was low, almost inaudible, but the words stung like a slap to his face. "Typical." David glanced up, curious. "What's typical?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. Emily hesitated for a moment before showing him her phone screen. It was a post about a black family celebrating their child's acceptance into an Ivy League school. Her expression was hard to read, but the dismissiveness in her voice was unmistakable. "Oh, nothing," she said quickly, brushing it off. "Just one of those stories." David's stomach twisted. He felt an invisible barrier rise between them. Emily's comment was subtle, but the tone carried a weight that David couldn't ignore. He tried to shake off his unease, telling himself he might be reading too much into it. But as the days passed, similar moments began to stack up like bricks in a wall he couldn't climb. The next incident happened at a dinner party with some of David's close friends, a mix of different races and backgrounds. The atmosphere was lighthearted, filled with laughter and clinking glasses. David had invited Emily to help her get to know his circle better. For most of the evening, she was her usual charming self, laughing at jokes and sharing stories about their honeymoon. But when his friend Marcus, a black lawyer, began discussing a recent case involving racial discrimination, David noticed Emily's demeanor shift. She smiled less, her posture stiffened, and she avoided making eye contact with Marcus. Later that evening, as they drove home, David brought it up gently. "You seemed a little quiet when Marcus was talking about his case," he said, glancing at her. Emily shrugged. "I just don't get why people make such a big deal out of these things. Isn't it all overblown?" Her words were like ice on his skin. David had always believed Emily to be compassionate and open-minded. This side of her was foreign, unsettling. David decided to keep his concerns to himself for the time being. Maybe Emily just needed more exposure to his diverse group of friends. Maybe he was overthinking it. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing rapidly. One evening, while Emily was out running errands, David was tidying up the living room. He accidentally knocked over her purse, spilling its contents onto the floor. As he crouched to gather her belongings, a small notebook caught his eye. It wasn't something he'd seen before, and curiosity got the better of him. He opened it, expecting to find shopping lists or random notes. Instead, what he found sent a chill down his spine. The notebook was filled with scribbled thoughts and comments, many of them laced with disdain for people of different races and cultures. "They don't belong here," one note read. Another said, "Why do they always play the victim?" David's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, each line more disturbing than the last. This wasn't just a fleeting opinion or an offhand comment. This was a pattern, a mindset. It was a part of Emily he had never known, and it terrified him. When Emily returned home that evening, David confronted her. He held the notebook up, his face a mix of anger and heartbreak. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice trembling. Emily froze, her eyes darting to the notebook in his hands. For a moment, she said nothing, as if calculating her response. Finally, she sighed, her expression hardening. "It's not what you think," she said defensively. "Everyone has thoughts, David. These are just private reflections." "Private reflections?" David echoed, his voice rising. "Emily, these aren't just random thoughts. This is who you are. How could you hide this from me?" Emily's calm demeanor began to crack. "I didn't hide anything," she snapped. "This isn't something that defines me. It's just opinions." David stared at her, his mind racing. The woman he thought he knew, the woman he married, was suddenly a stranger. The warmth of their home felt cold, the life they'd built together like a fragile house of cards ready to collapse. David could hardly sleep that night. The notebook sat on the kitchen counter like a cursed artifact, a physical representation of the cracks forming in their seemingly perfect marriage. Emily had gone to bed without another word, brushing off his questions with a dismissive wave of her hand. Her refusal to engage in a meaningful conversation about what he had discovered gnawed at him. Lying awake in the dark, David stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment of their relationship. How had he missed this? Was he blinded by love? Or had she been hiding this side of herself all along? The following morning, David woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of Emily humming softly in the kitchen. For a moment, he almost believed everything was normal. But as he walked into the room and saw her standing there, so composed, so seemingly unbothered, his unease returned tenfold. She greeted him with a smile, but David could see the tension in her eyes. It was as though she was waiting for him to drop the subject and move on. He couldn't. "Emily," he began, sitting down at the table, his tone calm but firm. "We need to talk about this." Emily set down her mug and sighed, the light-hearted facade slipping away. "David, I don't know what else you want me to say. It's just a notebook. It doesn't mean anything." David shook his head, his frustration mounting. "It's not just a notebook, Emily. It's your thoughts, your real thoughts. And they're not just random musings. They're hateful, and they're dangerous. How can you expect me to ignore that?" Emily's face hardened. "Dangerous? That's a bit dramatic, don't you think? Everyone has their opinions. I just write mine down instead of saying them out loud. Isn't that better?" David couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Better?" he echoed, his voice rising. "Emily, this isn't about opinions. This is about who you are, how you see the world, how you see people. How can I trust you after this?" Emily's smile faded entirely, replaced by a cold, defensive expression. "Trust me? David, don't act like you're some saint. Everyone has biases, whether they admit it or not. At least I'm honest with myself." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. David stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with a screech. "No, Emily, this isn't about bias. This is about hate. And if you can't see the difference, then we have a much bigger problem than I thought." Emily crossed her arms, her blue eyes icy. "You're overreacting. I knew you'd blow this out of proportion. This is why I didn't tell you. It's because you're so sensitive about this stuff." David's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Sensitive? You think this is about me being sensitive? Emily, do you even hear yourself? Do you realize what you're saying?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned away and began tidying up the counter, her movements sharp and mechanical. It was clear she wasn't interested in continuing the conversation. But David couldn't let it go. Not this time. The tension between them only grew in the days that followed. David tried to act normal around her, but the weight of what he had discovered hung heavy in the air. Every interaction felt strained, every glance filled with unspoken words. He found himself watching her more closely, searching for signs of the woman he thought he knew. But the more he observed, the more he realized how much he had overlooked. It wasn't just the notebook or the comments she had made. It was the way she avoided engaging with certain people, the subtle ways she distanced herself from conversations about race or equality. It was the way she laughed at certain jokes that made his skin crawl, jokes he hadn't paid attention to before, but now couldn't ignore. The patterns were there, woven into the fabric of her personality, and David felt like a fool for not seeing them sooner. One evening, as David scrolled through his phone, he stumbled upon an old photo of them together. It was from their first trip as a couple, a weekend getaway to New Orleans. They had been so happy, so carefree. He remembered how Emily had charmed everyone they met, how she had seemed genuinely interested in the city's rich history and diverse culture. Looking at that photo now, David couldn't reconcile the woman in the picture with the woman he now knew. Had it all been an act? Or had something changed along the way? The breaking point came a week later, when they attended a charity gala hosted by David's company. It was an important event, one that David had been looking forward to for months. He had worked hard to secure funding for a scholarship program aimed at helping underprivileged students, many of whom came from minority backgrounds. He was proud of what they had accomplished, and he wanted Emily to share in that pride. But as the evening progressed, David began to notice her discomfort. She was polite, of course. Emily always knew how to present herself in public. But there was a stiffness to her smile, a coldness in her interactions. When one of David's colleagues, a black woman named Angela, approached them to congratulate him on the program's success, Emily's reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Her smile faltered, her eyes darted away, and she quickly excused herself to get a drink. David followed her to the bar, his patience wearing thin. "What was that?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Emily feigned ignorance. "What was what?" "You know what I'm talking about," David pressed. "Angela came over to talk to us, and you couldn't even look her in the eye." "What's going on with you?" Emily sighed heavily, setting her drink down. "David, I don't feel like doing this right now." "Well, I do," David shot back. "Because I can't keep pretending this isn't a problem." Emily turned to face him, her expression cold. "You want to talk about problems? Fine. Here's the problem. You care more about what other people think than about me. You're so obsessed with being the perfect progressive hero that you can't even see how ridiculous you're being." David's jaw tightened. "This isn't about being a hero, Emily. This is about basic decency. It's about who we are, who you are. And right now, I don't like what I'm seeing." Her eyes flashed with anger. "Then maybe you shouldn't have married me." The words hung in the air like a knife between them. David stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to say. For the first time, he wondered if their marriage could survive this. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted it to. The silence in their home was deafening. After Emily's venomous words, "Maybe you shouldn't have married me," David had simply walked away, retreating to their bedroom. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind a hurricane of thoughts. The woman he had vowed to spend his life with had become a stranger, her words slicing through the trust and love they had built together. He thought about the countless moments they'd shared, the laughter, the dreams, the plans for the future, and wondered how much of it had been real. How could he reconcile the Emily he thought he knew with the woman who had just unleashed such cruelty? The days that followed were a tense dance of avoidance. David and Emily barely spoke, their conversations reduced to short functional exchanges about groceries or chores. The air between them felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the weight of their unspoken conflict had seeped into every corner of their home. David found himself staying late at work, pouring his energy into projects and avoiding the dread that awaited him at home. But no matter how much he tried to escape, the reality of their fractured relationship loomed over him. One evening, David found himself scrolling through his phone, aimlessly searching for something, anything, that might offer clarity. He stumbled upon an old photo of his parents, taken at a family barbecue years ago. They were smiling, their hands intertwined, radiating a love that had withstood decades of challenges. His parents had always been his model for what a marriage should be, built on trust, respect, and unwavering support. Looking at that photo now, David felt a pang of longing. He wanted what they had, but he couldn't ignore the growing realization that his marriage to Emily might never resemble the partnership his parents had shared. Fueled by frustration and desperation, David decided to confide in someone he trusted. He called his best friend Marcus, the lawyer who had sensed Emily's discomfort at the dinner party weeks earlier. Marcus had always been a steady presence in David's life, offering wisdom and perspective when he needed it most. They met at a quiet coffee shop downtown, the kind of place where they could talk freely without fear of being overheard. As they sat across from each other, David hesitated, unsure of how to begin. Marcus studied him, his expression calm but attentive. "You look like you've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," he said. "What's going on?" David took a deep breath, then began to explain everything: the notebook, Emily's dismissive comments, her behavior at the gala, and the cruel words she'd thrown at him in the heat of their argument. As he spoke, Marcus listened intently, nodding occasionally, but letting David get it all out. When David finally finished, he leaned back in his chair, his shoulders slumping, as if the act of recounting it all had drained him of energy. Marcus took a sip of his coffee, his eyes thoughtful. "Man," he began slowly, "I'm really sorry you're going through this. I can't imagine how hard it must be to see this side of someone you love. But the question you need to ask yourself is, what are you willing to accept? Because this isn't just about her words or her notebook. This is about her values, her core beliefs. And if those don't align with yours, it's going to be a long, painful road." David nodded, his gaze fixed on the table. "I know," he said quietly, "but it's not just about me. It's about the life we were supposed to build together. I thought I knew her, Marcus. I thought we were on the same page." Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. People can hide a lot about themselves, especially when they're trying to fit into someone else's world. But eventually, the truth comes out. The question is, now that you know, what are you going to do about it? David had no answer. That was the problem. He didn't know what to do. Part of him wanted to confront Emily again, to force her to see the impact of her words and actions. But another part of him was tired, too exhausted to fight a battle that felt unwinnable. He thanked Marcus for his advice and left the coffee shop, feeling more uncertain than ever. That night, David decided to take a different approach. Instead of confronting Emily directly, he began to observe her more closely, hoping to gain insight into her mindset. He paid attention to the media she consumed, the conversations she had with friends, and even the subtle ways she interacted with people in public. What he discovered only deepened his sense of betrayal. Emily seemed to surround herself with echo chambers, consuming content that reinforced her biases and avoiding perspectives that challenged her views. Her conversations with friends often included casual, offhand comments that revealed her prejudices, comments that made David's stomach churn. In public, she was polite but distant, her interactions with people of different races tinged with an almost imperceptible tension. It was as if she wore a mask, presenting herself as open-minded and progressive while harboring a vastly different reality beneath the surface. David's observations confirmed what he had feared. Emily's views were not fleeting or superficial, they were deeply ingrained. This realization left him at a crossroads. Could he continue to share his life with someone whose beliefs were so fundamentally at odds with his own? Or was it time to face the painful truth that their marriage might be beyond repair? The breaking point came one Saturday afternoon. David had invited Marcus and a few other friends over for a casual barbecue, hoping to recapture some sense of normalcy. Emily had reluctantly agreed, but her mood was noticeably sour from the start. As the afternoon wore on, her behavior became increasingly irritable, her comments more pointed. When Marcus mentioned a recent case he was working on, a civil rights case involving workplace discrimination, Emily couldn't hide her disdain. "Why is it always about race?" she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for David to hear. His jaw tightened, his patience finally snapping. He turned to her, his voice low but firm. "Emily, enough. This is my friend, and you're being incredibly disrespectful." Emily glared at him, her face flushing with anger. Disrespectful? I'm just being honest. Maybe you should stop trying to be everyone's savior and focus on your own life. The tension in the air was palpable. Marcus and the other guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to react. David took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he struggled to keep his composure. This isn't about being a savior, Emily. This is about being a decent human being, and right now, you're not showing any decency. Emily stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the patio floor. Maybe I don't want to be part of your perfect little world, she spat, before storming into the house. The guests sat in stunned silence, the sound of the door slamming echoing in the distance. David closed his eyes, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had hoped that bringing people together might bridge the growing divide between him and Emily, but instead, it had only highlighted how far apart they truly were. As the barbecue wound down and the guests began to leave, Marcus pulled David aside. "You did the right thing," he said gently. "You stood up for what you believe in. But now you need to figure out what you want to do next." David nodded, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he could no longer ignore the truth. Emily's actions and words had revealed a side of her that he couldn't accept, no matter how much he wanted to salvage their marriage. The life they had dreamed of building together was slipping through his fingers, and for the first time, he began to accept that letting go might be the only way forward. David spent the rest of the evening in a daze, replaying Emily's words in his mind. Her outburst at the barbecue had felt like the final blow to their already crumbling relationship. As the last of his friends left, Marcus lingered for a moment, offering a reassuring pat on David's shoulder. "You're stronger than this, man," Marcus said quietly. "You don't have to carry this weight alone. If you need anything, I'm here." David nodded, grateful for his friend's support, but the truth was, he felt completely alone. The house was eerily quiet after the guests had gone, the silence only broken by the occasional creak of the floorboards. Emily had locked herself in the bedroom, leaving David to clean up the remnants of the barbecue by himself. As he collected plates and discarded bottles, he couldn't shake the gnawing question in his mind. What had happened to the woman he thought he'd married? Was this who she had always been, or had something changed along the way? That night, David slept on the couch, unable to bring himself to face Emily. He stared at the ceiling, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a physical force. Their marriage was unraveling before his eyes, and he felt powerless to stop it. The memories of their happiest moments, laughing together during their honeymoon, dancing under the stars on their wedding night, felt like cruel reminders of what they had lost. How had they gone from being so in sync to feeling like strangers living under the same roof? The next morning, David woke to the sound of clinking dishes in the kitchen. Emily was making breakfast, her movements brisk and mechanical. He hesitated before entering the room, unsure of what kind of reception he would receive. When she looked up and saw him, her expression was unreadable. "Good morning," she said, her tone flat. "Morning," David replied cautiously, sitting down at the table. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. For a moment, neither of them said anything, the only sound the sizzle of eggs in the pan. Finally, David broke the silence. "We need to talk." Emily sighed, setting down the spatula with a sharp clink. "About what?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "You know about what?" David said, his voice steady but firm. "Last night, the barbecue, the way you spoke to Marcus and to me. Emily, this isn't just a one-time thing. It's a pattern, and it's not something I can ignore." Emily crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. "So what are you saying, David? That I'm a horrible person because I don't see the world the way you do?" David shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "This isn't about seeing the world differently. This is about respect, about decency. Do you even hear yourself when you speak? Do you realize how hurtful and dismissive you've been?" Her eyes narrowed. "Hurtful? Dismissive? David, I'm just being honest. Not everyone has to agree with you and your friends on everything." "It's not about agreeing with me," David shot back. "It's about showing basic respect to people who've done nothing to deserve your disdain. Do you even realize how your words make others feel? How they make me feel?" Emily's expression hardened, her arms tightening around her chest. Oh, so now I'm the bad guy because I don't worship at the altar of political correctness? Is that it? David stood, unable to contain his frustration any longer. This isn't about political correctness, Emily. This is about love, compassion, and understanding. The things that are supposed to form the foundation of a marriage, and right now, I don't see those things in you. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. For a moment, Emily said nothing, her gaze fixed on the floor. When she finally looked up, her eyes were cold. Maybe you're right, she said quietly. Maybe we're just too different. David's heart sank. He had hoped, even in the midst of their conflict, that they could find a way to bridge the gap between them. But Emily's words felt like a door slamming shut, final and unyielding. He nodded slowly, his chest tight with a mix of sadness and resignation. Maybe we are, he said softly. Over the next few days, David and Emily avoided each other as much as possible. Their once loving home, now a battlefield of silence. David threw himself into work, staying late at the office and finding solace in the company of his colleagues. But no matter how much he tried to distract himself, the pain of their fractured relationship was always there, gnawing at the edges of his mind. One evening, as David sat alone in his office, his phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "How are you holding up?" the text read. David stared at the screen for a moment before replying, "Not great. It feels like everything's falling apart." Marcus's response came quickly. "You don't have to go through this alone. Let me know if you need to talk." David hesitated before typing, "Thanks. I might take you up on that." When David returned home that night, the house was dark and quiet. Emily's car was in the driveway, but she was nowhere to be seen. As he climbed the stairs, he noticed the light in the bedroom was off, the door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, he saw Emily sitting on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "David," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how we got here." David sighed, sitting down beside her. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But I know we can't keep living like this. Something has to change." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to lose you," she said softly, "but I don't know how to fix this." David looked at her, his own heart aching. "I don't either," he said, "but I know that if we're going to have any chance of moving forward, we need to be honest with each other. Completely honest." Emily hesitated before nodding again. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's try." For the first time in weeks, they began to talk. Not arguing, not shouting, but truly talking. David shared his feelings of betrayal and disappointment, while Emily admitted to her own fears and insecurities. It was a painful conversation, but it was also a necessary one. By the end of the night, they had agreed to seek professional help, recognizing that their issues were too big to handle on their own. It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. As David lay in bed that night, he felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time it felt like there might be a way forward. In the weeks that followed, David and Emily began attending couples therapy. It was a tentative and fragile effort to salvage what was left of their marriage. Each session was filled with raw emotions, anger, sadness, confusion, but it was also a space where they could finally voice their deepest thoughts without fear of judgment. Their therapist, Dr. Harmon, guided them with patience, encouraging them to confront the issues that had driven a wedge between them. One of the earliest breakthroughs came during their third session, when Emily opened up about her upbringing. She spoke about her family's deeply ingrained values, many of which she now realized were steeped in prejudice. "I grew up hearing things that I didn't question," she admitted, her voice trembling. "It wasn't until I met David that I started to see the world differently. But I guess I never fully let go of those old ways of thinking." David listened intently, his feelings a complicated mix of empathy and frustration. He appreciated her honesty, but it didn't erase the pain her actions had caused. "Emily," he said carefully, "I understand that your upbringing shaped a lot of who you are. But at some point, we have to take responsibility for our own beliefs and actions. You can't keep holding on to the past if it's hurting the people around you." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know," she whispered. "I want to change. I really do, but it's hard to unlearn something that's been a part of you for so long. Dr. Harmon intervened gently, her tone reassuring. Change is never easy, she said, but the fact that you're here, willing to confront these difficult truths, is a step in the right direction. The key is to focus on growth, not perfection. Outside of therapy, David and Emily made a conscious effort to rebuild their connection. They began spending more time together, going for walks, cooking meals, and revisiting the things that had brought them joy in the early days of their relationship. But despite their efforts, the underlying tension remained. For every step forward, there were moments that pulled them back. An offhand comment, a disagreement, or the resurfacing of old wounds. One such moment came during a dinner party with Marcus and his wife, Danielle. It was a casual gathering meant to celebrate the success of the scholarship program David had worked so hard on. Emily had been hesitant to attend, but David had insisted. "This is important to me," he had said, "and I want you to be part of it." The evening started off well enough. Emily was polite and cordial, making an effort to engage in conversations and show support for David's accomplishments. But as the night wore on, a subtle tension began to creep in. When Danielle brought up a recent protest in their city advocating for racial equality, Emily's smile tightened. She nodded politely, but offered no input, her discomfort evident. David noticed, his stomach sinking. He knew that Emily's silence wasn't out of ignorance. It was a refusal to engage with something she still didn't fully understand or support. After the party, as they drove home, David confronted her. "Why is it so hard for you to participate in these conversations?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Emily sighed, staring out the window. "I just don't feel comfortable," she admitted. "It's not my world, David. I don't know how to be part of it." David shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's not about it being your world, Emily. It's about being willing to step outside of your comfort zone and show empathy for others. If you can't do that, then what are we even doing here?" Her silence spoke volumes, and David felt the weight of their struggle pressing down on him once again. As the months went by, David began to realize that their journey toward healing wasn't just about Emily changing. It was also about him deciding what he could and couldn't accept. He loved her, but love alone wasn't enough to bridge the chasm between their values. The therapy sessions had helped them communicate better, but they couldn't erase the fundamental differences that had come to light. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, David sat alone in the living room, staring at the photo album from their wedding. The images of them laughing, dancing, and promising forever felt like relics from a different life. He thought about the man he had been that day, so full of hope and certainty, and realized how much he had changed since then. Emily joined him, sitting down beside him on the couch. She looked at the album and then at David, her expression a mix of sadness and longing. "Do you think we can ever get back to that?" she asked softly, gesturing to the photos. David sighed, his heart heavy. "I don't know," he admitted. "I want to believe we can, but it's hard to ignore everything that's happened since then." Emily reached for his hand, her touch tentative. "I'm trying, David. I really am. I know I've hurt you, and I hate that I let my ignorance get in the way of our happiness. I don't want to lose you." David looked at her, his emotions swirling. He wanted to believe her, to hold on to the hope that they could rebuild what had been broken. But deep down, he knew that their relationship would never be the same. The love they had shared was real, but it was also built on a foundation of assumptions and unspoken truths that had now crumbled. Over the next few weeks, David and Emily continued their therapy sessions and tried to navigate the complexities of their relationship. But the more they worked on it, the clearer it became that their paths were diverging. Emily was making an effort to change, but it was a slow and painful process. And David, despite his love for her, couldn't ignore the growing realization that they were fundamentally incompatible. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, David finally found the courage to say what had been weighing on his heart. "Emily," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I think it's time for us to let go." She turned to him, her eyes wide with shock and sadness. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying that we've tried," David said gently. "We fought for this. But sometimes, love isn't enough. Sometimes the differences are too big to overcome. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she nodded slowly, her heart breaking. "I don't want to lose you," she said again, her voice trembling. "You're not losing me," David said, his own tears threatening to fall. "We're just choosing to let each other go, so we can both find the happiness we deserve." In the weeks that followed, David and Emily began the difficult process of separating their lives. It was a painful journey, filled with moments of doubt and regret, but it was also a chance for both of them to reflect, to grow, and to heal. David knew that the love they had shared would always be a part of him, but he also knew that letting go was the only way to move forward. As he packed up his belongings and prepared to start a new chapter, David felt a sense of peace. He didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was making a choice that honored both himself and the values he held dear. And that, he realized, was the truest form of love he could offer, to himself and to Emily.